Welcome back, my listeners, and to the new ones, welcome to the adventures of astronaut Joel, the first space marine devil dog. If you haven't already done so, please listen to the Regiment of the Damned Act 1 Part 1, before listening to Part 2. If you already have, thank you so much, and again, enjoy the audiobook of my creation. Now let's see what's going to happen next in Part 2 of the Regiment of the Damned. Chapter 2, Not So Quiet on the Western Front. 7:39 a.m. 15 days ago. Commissar Thaddeus, the Orcs have broken our lines again. We must order a retreat to the walls.
We both know a guardsman do not retreat.
Yelling over the sounds of screams of men dying.
If I see anyone retreat, I will shoot them dead in the back and let the Orcs or the other devils of this planet deal with them later. We do not retreat. We will hold the lines until reinforcement arrives.
Sir, we have been fighting the Orcs for over a month with just ourselves alone.
The sounds of men screaming out of fear and chaos coming down the lines of the trenches. The smell of the Orcs in his nose, the sounds of heavy exploding bombs just feet away, putting a deaf tone in his ears. Out of reflexes, putting both fingers in his ears to try to loosen the noise out of it like it would do anything at all.
Men are disappearing with no blood on the ground. We only have 3 weeks of blood scrubbers remaining in supply in the walls. We have no too little ammo.
Commissar Thaddeus' face is growing with abhorrence and disappointment to Sergeant Johnson.
All our tanks are unusable in combat. What are we supposed to do? Stand here and die for nothing? Like the other hundreds of us did, because of that prideful Sergeant Fields. You should have killed him on the spot, or better yet, chain him outside to suffer like the others.
No, Sergeant.
Pointing his finger at him.
I expect you and every other guardsman that is here now to stand and fight to the last breath for these grounds that hundreds of other guardsmen died for, and then you may die in the Emperor's name, and not until then. Those men died so we can live for 3 more weeks. You and I both know, if they breach these walls, we will not have to worry about the scrubbers. The Inquisition will destroy this whole planet to keep these wretched Orcs away from other systems. This is our last working relay station for this planet. If this goes quiet, we will all die. Do you understand me, Sergeant Johnson? We are fighting to live.
Johnson, thinking how Commissar Thaddeus has never shown this side of him before, almost human-like for once. The feelings of warm hope and pride were starting to replace the cold, tired body of the guardsmen. The feeling of the Emperor's wrath filled his body, and the outlet for such feelings would be felt at the sharp end of his chain sword.
For our fallen and for the Emperor.
Holding up his left arm, with his chain sword high in the air for all to see, and in his right hand a radio.
All units are advised to hold the line at all costs. I say again, hold the line. For the fallen, for these grounds, no more ground will be given today, no more.
Hearing men down the line repeating, for our fallen and for the Emperor.
Get ready, Sergeant, here they come.
Thaddeus, looking at the wall of Orcs covered in purple camo with a red and white cross axis on their chest and belts.
Fire at will when you smell them in the air. Keep the greenskins back off our grounds.
Thaddeus, thinking the only thing good about these greenskins is they like to come in close for the kill.
Guardsmen, prepare for close quarters combat. Do not stop fighting until your last breath has left from your lungs. That is an order. Remember, guardsmen, die by the Orcs or die by me. Choose your fate.
Taking a deep breath and pulling out his power sword, yelling over everything like a thunderous autocannon.
Charge!
Jumping from the trenches and hurtling over rubble and dead bodies of the fallen. As a clash of Orcs and humans collide, flashes of las guns firing in all directions. Explosions of frag grenades were thrown from both sides. The sounds of chain swords roaring in the air, going from a high pitch to a low grinding pitch as it digs into the thick green skins of the Orcs. In the corner of Sergeant Johnson's eyes, he sees a guardsman get ripped in half by a brute of an Orc, with the top half of him still screaming and fluttering as the knob bites the head off from the guardsman's remaining body. 2 other guardsmen rush over to the knob, one jumping in the air, the other one going low, stabbing the Orc trying to take it down. Johnson runs over with his chain sword in his hand to give help to them. revving it up to try to divert the orc so the two guardsmen will have a fighting chance to kill the monstrous orc. The knob was too powerful to manage, even before he was able to get there. The knob had crushed the head of the guardsman who jumped in the air with one hand and crushed the head of the one who came in low with his foot. Giving out a roar that moved the air around his ears with both hands open, still dripping with blood and brains. Johnson looking at the orc knob and revving up his chain sword as fast as it can go. Grabbing the hilt with both hands and lifting it up around his head and jumping in the air with a forward slashing motion, cutting off the hand that crushed the guardsman's head. The heavy muscle-bound 8-foot-tall orc grabs his nubbed wrist in pain, yelling out,
"That's me crushing hand, Oman."
Johnson coming back again, and raising his chain sword in the air, and cutting the other hand off, making the orc handless. Regaining his footing, Johnson swings back around, cutting the orc in half by grinding through the thick skin and bones of the orc that killed 3 guardsmen before his eyes, with the orc roaring in pain. Johnson's shoulders and head still getting pounded by the forearms of the orc, still hitting like a ton of bricks to his face and shoulders, and finally cutting the mighty orc in half. The top half of the orc's body falls over on Johnson, knocking him over to the ground. Feeling the full dead weight from the top half of the orc, trying desperately to remove the dead orc off his chest. Knowing if he stays put for too long, he is good as dead. Taking a deep breath and pushing for all that he has. He feels a sudden ease. He looks over and he sees a helping hand to removing the orc's torso on top of him. Johnson rising to his feet with the help of his chain sword, looking over to thank the guardsman who just saved him, looking down and seeing a pistol grip not like the others. The guardsman having no time to talk or to look back, he pulls his slung last gun from his back and continues fighting, jolting left, jolting right, rolling on the ground, shooting his last gun, and killing a Gretchen who was beating a smaller Gretchen for not moving faster, then disappearing into the smoke just as quickly as he showed up. Taking one last look, Johnson cuts the head off the orc just to be sure it is dead. Looking around for his next kill, he sees Commissar Thaddeus surrounded by 4 orcs. Fearing for the worst, he runs over to give a helping hand. Commissar Thaddeus seeing the 4 orcs moving in closely to surround him. Thaddeus holsters his bolt pistol and sees the fresh blood covering the orcs' bodies and with blood just slightly dripping from their axes. The biggest one, just short enough not to be called a knob of an orc, has a beheaded guardsman with an expression of fear, as it's silently yelling out a fearful scream at the moment of his death, just hanging around on the thick orc's neck. Thaddeus thinking,
"What a waste."
Looking around and quickly gauges his situation. Grabbing his power sword with both hands, in a defensive manner, waiting for them to make the first move, and wondering if he still has it. All 4 orcs come running towards the commissar. The one with the head around his neck gives out the biggest roar. Thaddeus does a quick tuck and roll to the left, avoiding the cluster of orcs. Regaining his footing and coming up with one hand on the ground and the other hand with his power sword. Coming up from behind one of the orcs and with a forward slashing motion, cuts the orc horizontal and chopping the orc in half. Taking 2 steps back to gain ground, giving more distance for himself and away from the orcs. The orc with the head around his neck starts laughing at the one who just got cut in half. Looking over him with his chain sword. Looking right and he sees a muscle-bound orc arm swinging an axe directly at him. Reacting quickly, he squats down to avoid the swing of the axe, just missing his head but knocking over his hat to the ground. Looking at his spotless hat now covered in dirt and on the ground. Thaddeus looks up and sees the orc chin exposed. Coming up with his power sword, thrusting it upward and into the chin and into the brain and straight through the thick skull of the orc. Bright blue sparks are seen at the tip of the sword as he is pulling it back out and spinning around, to chop off the head of the orc. Thaddeus looks over and into the eyes of the orc that is still laughing. The orc stops and sees his face reflecting at him from Thaddeus's black eyes. Giving out a big roar to challenge Commissar Thaddeus. Composing himself once again in a defensive manner with the power sword. Seeing that Sergeant Johnson has engaged with the 3rd orc, which is behind the orc he is fighting. Thaddeus looks back over to the orc with the head around his neck. The orc starts beating on his chest and yells out,
"That Z-hat's going to look goods on me when me's the new war boss."
Running towards him now at full speed, Thaddeus steps to the right and at the same time unholstering his bolt pistol and fires 2 shots at the head of the orc, causing the head to explode. The momentum and weight from the orc's body slides to his feet and stops just at the toe of his shiny boots. Holstering his bolt pistol, Thaddeus looks down at the dead orc.
Look at you, all dirty and smelly, very distasteful-like.
At that moment, a single squirt of blood from the orc's neck lands on Thaddeus' spotless shiny boots. Briefly closing his eyes and transcending with frustrations underneath his breath. Walking over to pick up his hat and brushing off the dirt and making sure it was back on and squared on top of his head. Looking down at the dead orc who knocked off his hat.
Nobody touches my hat and talks about it.
Spitting on the orc's dead body. Looking over, he hears Sergeant Johnson's chain sword engaged with the last orc. Thaddeus sees him parry all the orc's attacks, evading every swing and every punch thrown by the green muscle-bound orc. Seeing the orc overextend himself and throwing himself off balance, Commissar Thaddeus thinks.
Do it now, Sergeant.
Johnson sees the opportunity, drops to a knee, and activates his chain sword, going between the legs and going up and cutting the orc from the middle of his legs and up to his chest. The orc wallows in pain and discomfort. Thaddeus seeing this and thinks.
Finally, someone's been paying attention.
With dark green blood spraying all over Johnson's face, blinding him. Seconds later, the orc stops moving and slumps over dead. Grabbing his canteen, opening it, and dumping it into his eyes and looking up so the blood and water can drain off his face. Clearing his eyes of the orc's blood, he sees a bright ball of fire in the sky. Thinking to himself how odd it looks that it does not have any black smoke from the back of it, let alone no tail on it.
Commissar, do you see that?
Pointing up in the sky with his right hand holding his canteen.
I am a little busy right now.
Cutting the head off from the orc with his power sword that Sergeant Johnson just killed. With a smooth flick from the wrist, cleaning off the blade and looking up where Johnson is looking.
You see that, Sergeant? I told you if we hold the line, we will get reinforcements.
While looking around for others in the sky like this one.
Looks like a drop pod from a Space Marine chapter.
Saying with full confidence in himself.
Sergeant Johnson, get on the radio and tell everyone to keep fighting and to push forward so the Space Marines can deploy.
Yes, Commissar. With a big smile on his face.
All units, the Space Marines are inbound. I say again, the Space Marines are inbound. The Emperor answered our prayers. The Space Marines are here. Continue to fight and push forward and have no fear. Squad 1, 3 and 5 on the line now. All lasguns on full auto, keep pushing back the orcs. We must make a safe landing zone so the Space Marines can deploy. Concentrate, all fire on the right of Zone York, Oscar, Uniform 3. Artillery, when given the command. Artillery Battery 1, fire on Julian, Uniform 5, T. Battery 4, fire on Lima, Oscar 5, T, just forward area of the Green Swamp. Reserves, make your way to heavy laser cannons on the wall and cover Section Tree, Hotel 3, and Golf Alpha Mike 3. Over.
Roger that. This is Artillery Battery 1 and 4, relaying message to reserves, out.
Sir, we have. Thaddeus stopping Sergeant Johnson.
Something does not seem right. Why is there only one drop pod? At the minimum you should see at least a dozen coming in.
Thinking how odd this is, unless he finally did the unthinkable.
Sir, look, the orcs are retreating. The orcs are reacting to the drop pod coming in.
The ball of flames around the pod going out around it and pops out 3 big parachutes with red and white on them. Thaddeus thinking, why does this drop pod have parachutes? Johnson wiping the rest of the blood off his face with his right forearm.
Commissar Thaddeus, am I confused, or do I see a Space Marine drop pod with parachutes on it?
Thaddeus looking over at Sergeant Johnson and back at the drop pod.
Looks like the orcs are concentrating fire on the pod. Space Marine or not, whoever is inside that pod is going to be shot down if they continue to move that slow.
Thaddeus seeing hundreds of rounds flying past the pod and not one hitting it. Rubbing his chin covered with gray hairs against his dark skin and looking over back at Johnson.
Sergeant Johnson, have you spoken to the guardsman who does not have the same issue lost gun pistol grip yet?
Johnson, eyes widening from forgetting to do it earlier that day.
I have not, my commissar. I was in the process of trying to find him.
Looking up in the sky and still seeing the pod with its parachutes.
But I found the guardsman just minutes ago who has it. He saved my life not too long ago when I was trapped by an orc brute torso. He helped me to push it off me.
Closing his eyes, knowing what is about to come next would be far worse than any orc attack.
Sergeant, I have told you to never cut an orc brute in half like that. You must go between the legs. If you cut them in half like that, you will have less of a chance of them falling over on top of you, and we both know what happens to guardsmen who do not get up in time in an orc attack, don't we?
Johnson's feeling the glare from Commissar Thaddeus' eyes.
If I see it again, I am going to cut you in half. Do you understand me, Sergeant?
Yes, my commissar.
Thinking how he just literally dodged 2 bullets today. Seconds later, both seeing 2 incoming missiles flying in the sky heading towards the gray pod.
Looks like 2 missiles are going to hit it,
said calmly by Thaddeus. At that moment, the pod disengages its parachutes, now free falling at an alarming speed. 7 flares come shooting out of it on both sides of the pod, making the 2 incoming missiles redirect their course to either side of the pod and causing a fiery explosion just 7 meters away from the pod itself. The light from the explosions showed a land covered by the fog of war and ashes from nearby burning tanks and buildings and what used to be bunkers.
Looks like the pod has disengaged its parachutes on purpose, Sergeant. What are your thoughts?
Johnson, surprised by this line of questioning. Must be someone smart or lucky to pull that off, don't you say, Commissar?
Indeed, Sergeant.
Thinking to himself, what in the Emperor's name is going on here? It's looking like it's heading towards the swamp, sir. Thaddeus thinking about the artillery.
Sergeant Johnson, we need to stop the artillery firing. We need to make sure it is not a friendly before we wipe it out with our guns.
Commissar, the artillery was never given orders to fire from you, sir.
Very well, Sergeant. Get a group together and find that pod and report back to me at once.
Thinking, if he only had more guardsmen like Sergeant Johnson, he would be bored because he would have nothing else to do at his post. Yes, Commissar. Johnson turns around and starts walking away with his chain sword on the left shoulder.
And Sergeant,
still rubbing his chin and turning his head slightly to the right. Johnson stopping dead in his steps and looks halfway over his left shoulder.
Bring Sergeant Fields with you. I need to confirm something in my report.
Nods for acknowledgement. Yes, my commissar. As Sergeant Johnson walks back to the walls. He cannot help but realize that this walk back to the walls has never been quicker and more enjoyable than ever before. Now tune in next week as the adventures continue. Thank you again for listening. I really appreciate you all. Next week we will listen to Inquisitor Callus, the captain, and Sergeant Johnson, discussing the events right before Johnson and his men go traveling to the Green Swamps to find the unknown personnel who crash-landed. Also, who is Sergeant Fields, and what did he do? Stay tuned and may the Emperor protect you.